Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. My brilliant guest for today is a coach and a psychotherapist. He's originally based in the UK, and then he relocated to Brazil. Geoff Newton, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here, Geoff. Let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
That's a good question. I've always been interested in addiction since I was quite young. I remember at about 14 starting to smoke and drink, and it like we all experiment, but it grabbed me. I couldn't get away from it. I didn't understand then why. And that kind of went on till I was in my mid-20s, and I got pretty desperate. I was kind of getting addicted to all sorts of drugs and alcohol and different things. And I became desperate. I went into a clinic in London where I got detoxed. And then I went into a rehabilitation centre for 2 years in Forest Hill called Phoenix House, where it was very intensive. It was called a concept house, and they I don't think they exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, the theory behind the concept house it was a very, very big house in Forest Hill. And basically what they did was they made it into a small world of feelings. And the theory was for the clients, and there was, if I remember rightly, I think probably about 60 to 70 different clients there at times. You can imagine the dynamics in one big house with a massive big garden. But basically it was a house of feelings. Everything was designed to get the feelings to come up in us. Because we learned that in addiction, there is no such feeling a human being has that I want to drink. That's how I feel. It's I feel something, and the reaction is I want to drink because I feel something. So I feel like taking drugs. And I used to hear this a lot. Well, why is this? There isn't a feeling I feel like taking drugs. And the theory was that we looked under the feeling of I want to drink, I want to take drugs, and we looked at the triggers. And that was the feeling. So the intenseness of the concept house over 6 to 9 months in the main phase one was for us to get used to how we feel and not reacting to the feelings. And that stayed with me for my life. It was the theory behind me coping with a lifelong struggle. I didn't ask to have an addictive personality. It was gifted to me by nature and nurture. And it was something I needed to struggle with. So I've designed basically on my own experience and then my work later on around this kind of concept. That was my kind of basis. It's about the feelings. It's all about the feelings. Why is it some of us feel a certain way? Why do we react and need to take drugs and alcohol or pornography or gambling or whatever it is? It's not really, the addiction isn't really the point. That's the reaction. That's the anesthetic. That's part of the symptom. It's what it's all about. It's all about the feelings. And the feelings are all about usually what happens to us younger. This starts quite young. I worked with children for nearly 5 years at Place to Be in one of the schools, and I could almost point out the children that had addictive personalities. And I worked with children from 7 to 11, and that was quite an eye opener for me. I thought, wow, this is being initiated really quite young, and the links then between obsessive behavioural disorders and conditions like ADHD, ADD, and the links, and then working in a clinic, the links between personality disorders, narcissism, and they're all kind of like in this pot of kind of conditions that are closely linked to addiction. This work I'm doing and designing and developing is ongoing. I'm hoping one day to have got the whole package to be able to design a method that will help people. It's ongoing, so if it sounds a little confused at times, it's because it's still ongoing and changing and evolving. but I think in a couple of years I might be ready to write about this and then sort of share this and help people that fall through the net. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later. That kind of get missed out by AA and NA and CA and the A's and stuff and smart recovery groups.
So you've given us a trajectory of your life. About just out of curiosity, how did you end up in Brazil and why Brazil? And how long have you been there?
I was working for a place to be 1 to 2 days a week. And I was working for the Counselling group, which is a dry house, a clinic, a wet house, sorry, a clinic and a rehab. And I was doing relief work between them. So I was kind of moving around. So I didn't have any real commitments and I was in private practice. And my private practice was small. And my wife's father became quite ill. And she said, I have to go to Brazil to look after my father. Because there is no nanny state here. You know, the responsibility for looking after families here is the family's responsibility. And they are the you know, like the structure, you know, like in the UK, we have a structure where you know, we've got the NHS, which helps out. There is nothing like that here. So when she said that she wanted to come over, I said, well, look, I'll come with you. I don't have anything particularly holding here. I can wrap up my voluntary work. My private practice was small and coming to an end with my client group. And I was a relief worker, and there was plenty of relief workers. So I thought, you know, let's go for it. And I came out here, and Lucy was looking after her father, and I was helping out. And I got a little bored, and a couple of people said, oh, can you teach me English? So for a year, I just took a year out of therapy and taught English. And then it was partially yearning to get back into therapy and then partially the BACP. I think I had to practice within 2 years, but I had to go through my membership again. And I just advertised in one of the, I think it was Expats, was the first one. I think it's another one, Gringos. And I just put an advert on there saying that, you know, English speaking, I'm a counsellor in the UK, but I class myself as a psychotherapist here because counsellor doesn't translate. Psychotherapeuta is kind of what I am. So I am a counsellor. I've got 2 level 4s in integrative and person-centered counselling. I did integrative first and felt that I was missing something, and then went and did a diploma in person-centered. So I'm a grassroots counsellor twice, but I call myself psychotherapist. So if anyone sees my website here, that's the reason for the transition, not because I prefer one or the other.
You mentioned about your main approach in counseling, integrative and person-centered. Now, for those of us who is not familiar with those approach, would you mind giving us a snapshot of what actually those approaches entail?
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you the story. I was working in the film industry before I became a therapist. I did an access course into social work when I was younger. When I came out of rehab, I was doing voluntary work for NACRO, working with young offenders. And I've always had a yearning to do this kind of work. And I was working in the film industry on some big films on the model unit, like in Shepperton Studios. And I was very aware of the drinking and drug culture there, and you know, because the hours were very long, the money was great, a lot of people didn't have time to spend it, so people were kind of socializing at work. And I noticed that some people cope with it very well, you know, like in life, you know, the industry is just like life. Some people would have a couple of beers and just go home, you know, have a couple of beers at lunchtime, work through, go home at night, wasn't a problem. Some people had different problems. I started to regurgitate my theories on addiction and watching people, and I decided I want to get qualified and I want to do something about this, because this is something that's not going away. So I looked into CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and it was very difficult to get into if you were not a counsellor or a psychotherapist. So I kind of, that hit a bit of a brick wall, and this was ongoing for about a year. And then I started, our model unit was coming to an end. because of computer graphics were taking over. So the need to make and shoot models was going away. And they were scanning the models to use computer graphics to take over. So we were kind of being disbanded. So that really pushed me into thinking, right, I'm going to be a counsellor. And I found a course that was close to me. I lived in Hertfordshire, and it was an integrative course. And I didn't, do you know what, Dennis? I didn't really know what that was at the time. So I went to see the tutor. She was wonderful. And she said, look, there's a 12-week sort of like taster course. Why don't you come and check it out? And I loved it. It was about Freud, it was about Jung, it was about pearls, it was about, you know, all of the different therapists that I knew a little bit about. And it was learning like bits of, you know, the most important parts of their theories and bringing them together into my own experience, which was wonderful. It suited me. So maybe I like the idea of psychoanalytical or psychodynamic theory because, as I mentioned earlier, in addiction starts young. Now, I kind of knew that from my own experience, but I didn't know that until I started working with children. I started to see children with addictive traits. And I know, so psychodynamic and analytical, they want you to go back over your past. It's about your past. Where did this start? How can we link your past to the here and now? So that theory for me was one I loved. I loved that. I thought, okay, that's something I'm going to bring into my work as an addiction specialist. And then I loved Jung, you know, his humanistic ways, his kindness, his ability to think outside the box. I remember him saying something like, I'm probably going to butcher this because he was very eloquent and I'm probably not nowhere near as eloquent. But I remember him saying something like, every patient, he used to say in them days, we say client now, deserves a different therapy every time they come into the room. And I loved that. I thought, yes, you know, why would we be stuck in a methodical model where people are not stuck in methodical boxes? You know, they come with different issues and different moods and feelings every week. So why not be ready for what they bring and respond to that rather than be stuck in a model of, I will do it this way. So I remember really liking that. And that was why I did the integrative course. So I used bits that I like. Gestalt, I like the idea of somebody that may have issues with their family through, you know, a lot of families unwittingly, some of the time, unwittingly some of the time, sadly, pass down trauma and chaos to their children. One of the biggest factors, if not, I think it's, I haven't met anybody that has an addictive personality that hasn't experienced trauma. I haven't met anybody. I've read a great book as well, but I can't remember the guy's name. It's The Realm of the Hungry Ghost. He's got I think he's from Hungary. I can't remember. He's a famous doctor from Canada. He agrees with that. The Realm of the Hungry Ghost. And he agrees that he worked in a clinic similarly to the one I worked in London. And there is a link between trauma, chaos, and addiction. I would find it unusual for any of my clients to argue that. And if they did, I'd love to hear their argument. So we're looking at trauma as being part of the product of addiction, chaos. And what I've noticed that does is, if I studied a guy called John Bowlby as well, this was the beauty of being integrative, because I could study different therapists rather than one. Bowlby said the ideal upbringing is the secure base. It's I'll break it down into simple English. The secure base basically is the ability to bring your child into a family unit that has the feeling of security. And one of the biggest factors of feeling secure is love. And autonomy. Autonomy is so important. Autonomy, but boundaries. Now, what a difficult scenario to construct in a family. I've got to give my child enough autonomy to feel free, to be free thinking, but I've got to boundary my child enough to keep him or her safe. So if you think about that, in his theory, was the ideal a set of ingredients for somebody becoming a fully functioning human being as they get older, ready for the world, because the world is full of boundaries. Laws. If I drink and drive and I hurt somebody, I will probably go to prison. That's a boundary. It's a law. So what he was representing was a system that was getting the children ready in a safe environment for the world. Now, if we look at the opposite to that, we look at the opposite is insecurity, chaos, and trauma. The child lives in fear. One of the biggest feelings that child will have is cortisol. It's the fight, flight, or freeze feeling. And they're on their guard. They are perceptive. They are on it. They're very strong, very resilient, but they're very switched on. They don't usually know how to relax. That's where drugs and alcohol come in, because it allows them to relax, because you can't sustain that amount of kind of lifestyle of adrenaline and fight, flight, or freeze. Can you imagine waking up in the morning, your first feeling is cortisol, adrenaline, without security. So that goes back usually to the family. So Gestalt allows the client to be able to address the family issues without actually needing the family. There's different things. You can write a letter to the family explaining what they did to you. And you can burn it, you can take it home, you can keep it, you can lock it away. This I like this idea, because often children of families that enable addiction aren't usually responsive to this kind of, not always, we all change, but not usually responsive to wagging a finger about, this is what you did and this is why I'm like this. And then we have the empty chair as well by Gestalt, which is somebody, when they're in a relationship that they feel relaxed enough, they can say, right, I can say, well, can we do the empty chair technique, where you talk to your father or your mother metaphorically and say what it is that you would love to say to them. And they face an empty chair and they talk to it and they express themselves and they let that stuff up. So that's another technique that I learned because I was an integrative counsellor, and that's kind of like basically what I did. I picked the parts out that I felt were very helpful for people with addictive personalities.
Now, Geoff, sorry.
Sorry, go for it. No, that's.
No, I was just gonna ask you about your area of specialization, which is, evidently it's about addiction, and I suppose you've been often asked what causes addiction. Is it nature, nurture? So if you could just talk to us about addiction.
Okay, it's interesting, because I think what I've noticed is that not everybody gets addicted, and some people live through terrible childhoods and don't get addicted and become, I've got a personal friend who lived through a very tragic addictive childhood with a father that had severe alcohol problems, and him and his two brothers, they didn't drink, and that's very unusual, but that happens. So that brings us to another question. Why? Why would one person or one family experience even less trauma than another, and why would they become addicted to a substance or to gambling or pornography or whatever, sex or work, workaholics, whatever? Why one lot and why not another? And that's interesting. I think that's where nature comes in, and neuroscience is answering some of these questions, but not all of them. My theory, and this is unfinished, but it's a part theory, and it's based on, I've noticed that without question, trauma and chaos is part of the ingredient towards addictive personality, but not for everybody, but in the main. But the other thing I've noticed is oversensitivity. And again, I can honestly say that I haven't seen anybody in my practice and in my work, and there could well be, but I'm just from my experience, that hasn't got oversensitivity as part of their personality to addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, oversensitivity, I think a lot of therapists would agree, makes us great empaths. It makes us very able to be empathic towards other people.
Mm-hmm.
The downside to that trait or that facet is that we feel a lot more than the general population. If somebody says something to somebody with oversensitivity, it hurts them more deeply than it would somebody that had, let's say, the secure base upbringing, the autonomy, the resilience. It tends to hurt them less than it does somebody who had the ingredients of chaos, trauma, and that kind of thing. But we don't know where that comes from. It doesn't seem to come from the upbringing. It seems to be, and this is a bit of a hunch based on my experience and my personal experience, it seems to be something we're born with. And if that theory is right, I'm still working on this. If that theory is right, that's where I believe the nature comes in. That's where the nature plays the part, because it just doesn't explain why you can have two brothers. I remember a story, I can say this because it wasn't a client, and it was a story that I learned as part of a training. Two brothers, one became a very, very successful banker working in the city. The other one done very well up until a point, but then fell off the wagon because of his addiction, and ended up, the story he told on the video was, I woke up one day in a skip, in a builder's skip. And why would that happen? There's two people born in the same family, similar upbringings. Why one would be so successful? Maybe he was a workaholic. Maybe he channeled his addiction into something. But why would somebody feel the need to anesthetize themselves, to take an anesthetic? Why would somebody feel the need to soften themselves? I've heard many people in addiction say heroin is like cotton wool. It's like taking heroin is like putting cotton wool all around me. It protects me, softens my feelings, makes me feel good, protects me against the world. And if you think about that statement, I hear that a lot. Like living in a cloud was another one. If you think about that and oversensitivity, that kind of fits. Why is it somebody feels the need to take an anesthetic to make themselves feel protected? And it's another person with, say, an addiction to work or career actually doesn't feel the need to take an anesthetic, but will channel the obsession, because it is an obsession, in another area. I mean, these are interesting questions, and this is the work I'm slowly evolving and trying to work out through my clients and through my own personal experience.
It'll be interesting to hear how your theory progresses. It's really an ongoing debate whether it's nurture or nurture. But another thing that I would like to ask you, Geoff, is what's the difference between being socially active around alcohol, drugs, and the difference with that and being addicted? How do we establish the difference?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, because in the middle of, you've got somebody that is very successful and very social, and actually functions very well. Now we have something called functioning addicts, that function very, very well. Get up to work 5 days a week. Sometimes don't drink in the week, maybe from Monday, Sunday till Thursday or something like that. And then come the weekend, their pastime is drinking and taking drugs. Are they addicts? That's the question.
Exactly.
Now, what I would say is, we've got to think about addiction as being, a choice as well. There is a certain amount of choice. I know that we've learned, I really believe that everything we learn, whether it's driven through trauma, chaos, or whatever, can be unlearned. I really, really believe that. I'm not saying it's easy. So what tends to happen, and this is a bit of a generalization, but again, this is something I've noticed, the functioning alcoholics or drug addicts or social, like drink and drug people, they tend to start off quite young. And then what tends to happen is some people drift away from that, get married, have a family, or get into a relationship, like traveling, doing work or whatever, and it dissipates. And then they find other things. What tends to happen with the people with the addictive personalities, it doesn't dissipate. It goes on and evolves. And I remember I was working at City Roads, and I remember one of my clients saying that there was a rehab. I think the rehab was for either under 21s or under 25s, and the government was pulling the funding. And my first reaction to that was, oh, wow, how unfair is that? And then when I looked into it more, I realized that people under 25 don't usually want to stop drinking and taking drugs because it's not a problem. It becomes a problem, and this is again a generalization, but it's something I've noticed. It becomes a problem usually after 30, when the damage, the long-term damage, maybe over 15 years, starts to take its toll to the nervous system. If you think about any kind of anesthetic addiction, it's kind of like a repressant. So what tends to happen is you're using the anesthetic to push the stuff down, to not deal with it. Eventually, you know, as Freud said, anything that's repressed needs to be expressed. So after 15 years of anesthetizing a part of you, it wants to come up. And it usually comes out through your nervous system. And I hear things like, I under the guilt quilt, you know, like after a weekend of really hitting it hard, cocaine, alcohol, whatever, on the Monday morning having to get out of bed and feeling that guilt and the shame, and they call it the guilt quilt. And the phone, I've heard people say that the phone is like, if my phone rings, the fear, and it's like a hot potato, I don't want to pick it up. Now that's when I think it shifts. And the good question is, why do some people, it's easy for it to dissipate, and for some people it goes on until the point where they can't cope with it anymore, then they start to find people like me. And I've noticed it's normally, if I was going to pick an age, it's about 35 years of age.
Is that 35?
That seems to be, yeah, between about 30 and 40. But if you were going to say, like, what kind of, I would say the average would be about 35. Seems to me when people start to realize even the, you know, I use the spectrum of, say, 1 to 10. 1 being somebody who's addicted to chocolate on weekends. A 10 would be somebody that will take anything that's going just to numb themselves, and have been doing it for a very long time. So depending where you are on that spectrum, depends on how easy or hard it is to deal with it. But most people get to about 35 and say, you know, this is too difficult, and I need to look at to what I've been doing. And I think that's the difference between addiction and non-addiction. And that might sound a bit vague, but it's very hard to pinpoint. You know, why is it that some people at 29 would just stop? They'll get married, have kids, and become fully functioning. But they would be partying with the same group. And some of the other group will just go on and at 35 say, I need some help. And a lot of them don't want to go to AA because of I love AA and the A's. I think they're a wonderful association. But what I do think is there is, whether it's true or not, but I did feel it when I went, but that was way, way back. There is a feeling of, if you don't kind of like, if you relapse, there is a kind of a link to shame, I think. I think that's fair to say. And I think there is a big link between shame and addiction and guilt. I think there's a link there. So it's very, very complex. It's got so many different variables. It's hard to pinpoint why one of the group would go off and go to AA and cope with the shame and face the shame, while another would come to me and say, I've been doing this for 15 years, and you can sense their shame and guilt. And they don't want to stop drinking, some of them. They want to carry on, but they want to maintain it and get it into
Mm-hmm.
a more copable kind of like entity, if you like. Other people say they've just had enough, and you get many people. So it's so varied and it's so complex, and it's got so many different kind of connotations to it. It's no wonder I've been thinking and trying working with this most of my life, and I still only feel like I'm scratching the surface at times.
Exactly. And Geoff, thank you for giving us an overview about addiction. But I want to understand what's the residue from addiction.
The residue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good question, Dennis. That's a very good question. Again, you know, I do use a scale from 1 to 10. I think I find it helpful. I think my clients find it helpful. One of the first sessions,
Mm-hmm.
I developed this from working with children.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the model it come from, but it's like from 1 to 10, how happy are you? And then as we go on through the sessions, it would be from 1 to 10, how happy are you? And what we're trying to look at is progress. Oh, when you started, you were a 3 and now you're a 5. What's made the difference? You know, that kind of thing with children. And I do that with addiction. So what I do is I say, from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the absolute highest and the hardest you can imagine somebody addicted to. And we go from there. So that determines the residue. If you've got somebody that is absolutely not capable of functioning without a substance inside their body, mm-hmm. you can imagine the residue. Often the residue from a 10, somebody with that kind of addiction that I've worked with will be out committing crimes, will be prostituting, anything that goes. Now the residue, when I worked in rehab, the residue from some of them really high addictions can be too difficult to turn around for some. Mm-hmm. You know, you're talking about, when you talk about shame and guilt, I mean, basically shame and guilt is doing something against yourself that doesn't feel like it's naturally what you want to do, something like that. And then there's the societal kind of looking down and wagging the finger, and that adds to that shame and guilt and that kind of thing. Sometimes, you know, the damage has been so, you know, done for so long, over such a long time, it's very difficult to turn around. So the residue can be with them for their life. You know, it would be something that they will maybe never get over. Mm-hmm. And it will be an ongoing battle. And that's where I think AA and NA do remarkably well. I think they do remarkably well because the people with that kind of addiction and them kind of problems really do need an ongoing support system. And the A's do that brilliantly. You know, they've saved millions of lives. I mean, they're an amazing association. Mm. So the residue from that is you will be fighting your addiction for the rest of your life, more or less. You get somebody around a 5 to a 7 or an 8. I've found, and this is in my work, that they can unlearn a lot of the habits that they've learned and reintroduce new ones. And the residue for them will be something like, you know, it differs, I'll generalize, will be something like, I have done 12 years of drinking to avoid something that happened to me or my childhood or whatever, and catching up and the waste of time. So you've got a grieving process. The people that go through that don't have the residue where it's disabilitating or debilitating. They do have the ability to look back and say, wow, I've been doing that for 10, 12, 15 years. Mm-hmm. What a waste. And there's a grieving process in that. And also there's one thing I've noticed as well is there's a stunting of emotional growth. And what I mean by that is somebody uses a substance, even if it's just socially weekends, you're not working through stuff that the rest of society would be working through. You know, like when things get really tough, you know, people don't go for a drink, they go and talk to someone or go to a therapist or do whatever. They grow through them stages in their lives. People who use substances tend not to grow through them because they use a crutch. So the residue from that would be having to work through the stuff that they didn't work through. So there is an emotional kind of neglect, if you like, which needs to be addressed. So they need to grow, they need to grieve often, and they need to learn a habit, unlearn an old habit and learn a new one. That's quite a lot of work. And I have a theory. One thing, you know, going back to the realm of the hungry ghost, I think it was in that book. So I read so many books and so much. And the neuroscience is coming out. One thing I've heard from my clients over the years is, and mainly the higher level people with addiction issues at higher level, is I feel like there's something missing inside. I feel like there's a hole, there's an empty space, and I fill it with the drug of choice or with whatever I do. I hear that a lot. And then I realized that neuroscience say, and going back to Bowlby, the secure base versus the traumatic lifestyle of a child in trauma and chaos. One of the ingredients for the mind to fully function and to grow is that security, that autonomy, security, love. Now, these are the ingredients for a fully functioning mind. The trauma and the chaos tends to not feed the mind what it needs. And neuroscience is saying people with addictive personalities and certain conditions have tiny little pockets in the mind, in the brain, just tiny little pockets that were not grown properly, if you like a muscle, like any muscle. You know, in the 50s, if you didn't have enough calcium, you would get polio, say, because you didn't have enough ingredients. And they're saying there's something maybe like that. And then I thought one day, you know, isn't it interesting that almost all of my clients, the high level ones, are saying there's something missing inside. It's pointing to their body usually. But neuroscience is saying there's tiny pockets that weren't formed properly in the mind. And I wonder if them tiny pockets were something that weren't formed. Are they the holes? Are they the parts that are missing? And what the encouraging thing from neuroscience as well is that, you know, the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, neuroscience has turned that on its head. You know, our mind has plasticity, our brain has plasticity. The neurological pathways in our brain can be reignited and can be regrown. And, you know, going back to my other diploma in person-centered therapy, and I think most of my clients would agree, one of the biggest contributing factors in therapy is the relationship. And one of the best ways to create a therapeutic relationship is the person-centered theory, using the core conditions, empathy, UPR, non-judgmental, these kinds of things. So what I found out through my work is being person-centered, which was purely kind of accident that I went into it, but I felt like I needed to do something. When I started working in addiction, I was one of the only person-centered therapists there with an integrative diploma as well, so I was both. But what I noticed quite quickly was the person-centered theory, the base of it, created the relationship, which is very difficult with somebody with a high-end addiction. But also, very quickly, the trust started to form, and people would start to tell me very deep and often say, I haven't told anyone this. Deep and sometimes disturbing. And that ability to get this stuff out and not repress it seemed to have a healing quality. And I think that, you know, going back to neuroscience, I think it's the relationship, it's that trust, it's not feeling judged. You know, most people with addiction problems feel shame, which is a judgment. What I was saying was that, you know, who am I to judge you? Personally, I've been there as well, which really did help because, you know, I often think of some of the things I got up to as a younger person, think, you know, who am I to judge? So I'm sure they felt that I was non-judgmental naturally because I didn't feel I had a right to anyway. And I have a feeling that really does help. And I feel that really does help turn around some of the old habits. And I think if you was going to ask me what's one of the biggest things that has helped people that I've helped, and I've helped quite a lot of people now, it would be the relationship. The The relationship allows for a client to talk about things that they probably have never talked about in their life. And that has a healing quality.
Now, talking about the healing process, can you talk us about the different services? You know, you mentioned something earlier about wet house, detox, rehabilitation, and aftercare. Can you talk to us about those services available for people with addiction?
Yeah, I look back on my life and with a certain kind of melancholic irony and laugh to myself. As I said, I was a young guy. I was really quite desperate. When I say I was young and I was pretty messed up, I remember being quite suicidal. You know, I was 25. I was quite young as well. I really was desperate. I was kind of a bit of an exception. I think there was part of me that realised this life wasn't for me. My marriage was failing. I was desperate. I had no money. I was pretty desperate. And I went to a hospital and I spoke to a doctor who gave me the number of the clinic. And it was called City Roads. And sadly, last year it went under with the austerity cuts and everything after about 45 years of functioning. Which I'm really upset about. It was, I think, the only referral unit in the whole of Europe. It went under, and anyway, they took me in, and I went off to rehab after there. They convinced me to go to this rehab, and it changed my life. It saved my life. I'm sure of that. And ironically, probably about 10 years ago, I went back and worked there, and I was one of a lot of people with lots more experience than me, but not the qualification of a counsellor, but would leave me standing with their experience. You know, they're amazing workers and some qualified counsellors as well, more in the rehab side, but not in the clinic, mainly doctors and nurses, psychiatric nurses and drug workers. I went to work there, and the clinic basically is a place where we detox people. So somebody would come in with alcohol abuse, say, and what we would do is we'd put them on a course of, the doctors would, on a course of, say, diazepam or Librium or whatever, to stop them fitting. There's other drugs as well, and to get them ready for rehab. And rehabilitation, like what I went through, would be the second stage. So what you would be doing is you wouldn't, as a therapist at the clinic, I would be using CBT. I wouldn't be using anything else, because one of the theories about working there was, I don't want to take anyone too deep. This is not the place. This is somebody coming off of their substance of choice. Sometimes for the first time in many, many years, there's a lot of emotions coming up. But the one thing I noticed was the cognitions. When people stop using their drug of choice, the first thing that ignites is the cognitions. It's almost the overthinking. And one of the best models I found for working in the clinic was CBT, working with the cognitions, trying to slow them down, trying to get them to not project or to reflect, trying to get them more in the moment and trying to get them more present. It's very helpful. Then in rehab, what we do is we do the opposite. We want to take them to where the emotions and where their past and linked to where they started their addiction, the reasons why they think it, you know, they need to use drugs where other people don't, and that kind of thing. And we have group work and one-to-one therapy, and I was part of the aftercare program. People coming back, some people coming back, which I helped design with the manager there, David Hoy, which is great therapist, wonderful man. And ironically, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, Oak Lodge went under. So that was 2 of the services I worked for that went under in the last 5 years. So God only knows what's going to happen now.
Yeah, it's actually really bad.
It's terrible. And that's why I've got this bit between my teeth about trying to work this out as best I can with all the knowledge I can, somehow try to write this down. And with a very close friend and colleague, hypnotherapist, I love hypnotherapy also. Done ethically. We are trying to write a book slowly and put our theories down, and maybe even one day run a group or something, or get some groups going, because we need to fill some kind of gap because the hole that's being left by this, you know, I'm going to name the Tory government because they're the ones who started the austerity, you know, years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's devastating, and I can only see it getting worse. I mean, some wonderful colleagues out there doing some wonderful work still. So I don't want to take anything away from them. And again, the A's and the Smart Recovery Group and other groups do some wonderful work. But there is a lot of people that are desperate, that haven't got the space, or that those services don't fit for them. You know, I'm very lucky. The people I'm working with now that fall through the net, as I say, because the services are not there, have the money to pay for me, and we work together and often turn their addiction around. But there's a lot of people who can't afford this kind of therapy, you know.
Mm-hmm. Now, Geoff, you mentioned earlier, sorry.
The wet house is basically the place that they go, a lot of people go when they're homeless. So they go into a wet house, which is the very first port of call, where basically we try and encourage them to change. The very grassroots. It's where people will still be using substances, and we will try and show them the reasons for them to stop versus the reasons to carry on. And that's very difficult. So I've worked through the 3 services, right from 3. So that's given me an experience personally. I've been through that as well, and working with different people through them 3 different stages. And working with children as well, and seeing the traits in children. So what a journey that I've experienced. Yeah, very, very fortunate to experience this journey.
Now, Geoff, you mentioned that you tried to adapt to a particular individual when you're trying to deal with their addiction. But would you say that there is a particular individual was the greatest influence to your work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the greatest individuals that I've worked with personally was a guy I just mentioned. He was the manager at Oak Lodge, and he was a psychodynamic therapist. He was the manager. And he, I think, was probably the biggest influence on me. I knew him for many years before as well. We met way back. Was one of the biggest influences because of his ability, because of the changes he made personally, I think, one. And there was something about him. He was a man of few words, but what he said were always very profound. And I think the reason I have so much admiration for him was because he so passionately believed in the work he did, that it kind of, you know, when Jung talks about connectivity, it's almost like you could feel, you could sense this guy's belief in you, in the belief in what he did. And that somehow had a healing kind of process. And you know, this is the other thing that hasn't really been talked about, you know, much in addiction. There's a lot of structures and a lot of methods, but there is, you know, that human connectivity, that belief in each other. I think the A's do that very well, part of the time. But he had that, and when I say people believed in him, therefore they started to believe in themselves. He would be the therapist that I would name that I've met. David Hoy would be the one.
David Hoy.
But as David Hoy, yeah, he was the manager of Oak Lodge. He was an amazing man. He was an amazing therapist. He died 6 years ago. No, 8 years ago. 8 years.
Now, Geoff, sorry.
I think the second would be probably Carl Rogers.
Carl Rogers, of course.
The
a lot of people in the counselling, within the counselling industry, really have, you know, they can really identify with the works of Carl Rogers. Now, what I want to ask you, Geoff, is that over the years you've been working with people, helping them with their addiction, but have you come across a number of misconceptions? And I suppose if you could take this as an opportunity to address those misconceptions about addiction.
I think the biggest one, I constantly, occasionally argue kind of the point of the person with an addictive personality. I hear a lot of, I remember the slogan in the 80s, I don't know if you remember, just say no to drugs, you know, and alcohol, whatever, just say no. Well, sorry, it's just not that easy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a misconception. You cannot just say no.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody with an addictive personality has a condition. It's a condition that is lifelong. We've discussed today. It's got the nature part to it and the nurture part.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that's ingrained inside a person's psyche,
mm-hmm.
and maybe even their personality. Mm-hmm. It's a condition. It's not an illness, I don't believe, but it's a condition. It's been conditioned into somebody with maybe some natural elements. And trying to convince people that, you know, and I find that people that have had direct experience with somebody close to them that's got addiction really just often, you know, I've worked with families as well. I did a impact, it's moving parents and children together within addiction. Some of the family members just don't get why they can't just stop. And that's the biggest misconception is it's not that easy. It cannot just be stopped. We will always meet somebody that rocks the boat. And I hear this as well. Yeah, but I know somebody, a landlord of a pub in London that drank for 40 years and was a terrible alcoholic and one day just stopped. You're always going to find exceptions to the rule. But in general, and the people that can't understand why they can't just stop will grab hold of these stories and these individuals. Yeah, but he just stopped. But they're not looking at the bigger picture. This is something, as I said earlier, that starts very, very young. It's something that's innate in somebody. There are traits within the personality, I believe, that are more susceptible to addiction. So you've got the nature, and then you throw the trauma, the chaos, which can be different levels for different people. And then you've got the grassroots of addiction. Now you throw a substance or two or three over many years on top of those ingredients. And then you've got somebody who's conditioned into using a substance after maybe 15 years, 20 years, 30, 40 years sometimes, that cannot just stop. They cannot. So what I would ask people to do is have empathy. Try and understand. If you don't get it, just try and understand that at least one thing, they can't just stop. You'll get the odd person that does it. God knows how they do it. I've met them. But they're a rare breed. But in general, that's the misconception. You can't just stop.
And Geoff, for those who want to follow your footsteps and become a psychotherapist and a counselor, can you recommend a good resource or a good starting point to be, you know, like an effective counselor?
Yeah, I would. I think, you know, I kind of went into it a little bit blind and kind of out of date. And one of the things that, as I said earlier, when I went to Smallford College in St Albans, and I met Jackie Lloyd, was my tutor, amazing tutor and therapist. And she said to me, you know, look, there's a 12-week course. Just go on the 12-week course. And it was interesting. I can't remember the actual numbers, but I would say at a guess, something like half were gone at the end of the 12 weeks and didn't go on. But it was a great way to see whether I want to do this or not, rather than sign up to a couple of thousand or a few thousand quid for a year course and then realise halfway through, wow, I didn't realise how tough this is. You know, this is tough work. You know, I'm not going to, I enjoy helping people, but I pay a price. You know, I pay a price with my life and sometimes my emotional and psychological kind of condition as well pays a price. I've got to be very careful because I am somebody with an addictive personality. I've fought this my whole life. This isn't easy for me, and I'm getting triggered often by my clients, and I can empathize deeply with them. I care deeply. So I pay a price. So be careful if you're coming into this specific field with an addictive personality as well, because it's that much more. I hear a lot of my colleagues say, I love my job. It's most wonderful. And I envy them. I envy them so much. Because I think I would love to love it like you do. The problem with being an addiction specialist working with people with addictions, when you've got an addictive personality, it's, we call it the parallel process. You know, it's not as straightforward. So I love helping people, but find my work very difficult and very challenging at times. For me, it's not a vocation, but but it's something I'm very glad I got into.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finally feel I can't carry on, which I don't think will be that far off, maybe a few
Mm-hmm.
years away, I will sit back and I'll write about this, hopefully, and try and help people that way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's difficult. Take your time, do a 12-week refresher course,
Mm-hmm.
find out if you like it, and then go from there.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine your line of work, Geoff, being really stressful and very challenging. So how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Well, before the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
it was a number of things. I mean, God, how long ago was that? Maybe 20 years ago. I started judo. I boxed a little. Started judo. I love martial arts. I found that gave me the stress relief.
Mm-hmm.
I love the gym. I became a kung fu teacher in England. One of my close friends and colleagues was a master in Sansu Kung Fu, and I became a black belt, second degree black belt in Sansu Kung Fu, and I was a teacher. I loved it. I loved it. It gave me something that gave me the balance to de-stress, to jump off my world for a little while. You know, if you think about addiction, it's wanting to jump away from your world into another world, like using the substance, right? That's what we do. This gave me a positive jump off the world, where me and my friends, our pupils, would go into a dojo and practice and concentrate on something really healthy
Mm-hmm.
for a couple of hours. And that was my jump off the world for 2 hours, a couple of times a week, go to the gym. That was my positive way of dealing with the world and my addiction as well, you know, in a very positive way. And that brings me back just quickly to the strategies that I use for people
Mm-hmm.
to turn their addiction around. When you stop using your substance of choice, there's a big hole in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You have to fill it with something positive. Otherwise, you go back to what you know. This is how the mind works, right? So what we do is we slowly find, what do you like to do? What do you like? What are your fantasies? I don't know, horse riding, swimming, bike riding, running, you know, all the stuff that you felt you wanted to do, but your substance stopped you doing. We slowly bring them in. And that fills slowly the gaps. Woodworking, whatever. You know, crochet, you know, knitting, art, whatever it is that you want to do that takes you away from the pressures of life that people with addictive personalities feel they need a crutch to cope with. We fill it with other things that are inside of them. We all have them.
Yeah.
We've got to get them, and we've got to introduce them in a strategic way to move them away from where they were to where they want to be. And that's how we break the habit. That's my theory.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And finally, Geoff, what's in the pipeline? You mentioned something about you're in the process of writing a book, but what else? Any speaking engagement? Any Zoom webinars?
I'm, as you know, Dennis, I'm a big fan of APA, ANA. I'm involved as a torchbearer. I'm very privileged, honoured to be involved there. And we've got a meeting tomorrow, and
Mm-hmm.
I've done the interview with you today, which is amazing. Thank you. So I guess I haven't got any plans because part of my process as well is not to project. I don't like to project. I like to be present.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm present, I'm calmer. Mm-hmm. So what I tend to do is I wait for things to happen. Like, you know, I met you through ANA and you said, would you like to do an interview? And I try and let them come. So we've started writing a book, but it's not that we can't write the book. It's the process of what it is that we're trying to develop probably won't be ready for another few years, if not longer. Mm-hmm. So that's ongoing. So that's something that will happen, and, you know, God willing, and my health is good enough to get me to that point. But again, you know, like Carl Rogers stood up in front of, I think it was Harvard, but I'm not sure, in front of the expert therapist, and started to talk about the non-expert way, the person-centered way. And he was kind of laughed at. Well, he developed that system over many years. You know, what I'm trying to do with my colleague, who's also a hypnotherapist and suffered similarly to me, is we're trying to develop something new by working with our clients to get the information we need to develop this system. We don't even know what it looks like yet. Mm-hmm. So that's the plan, but I don't know how far away that is. But that excites me. I mean, if we could get anywhere close to that goal, you know, and you know, as my colleague said, you know, even if we could just help one person,
exactly,
just one, but I'm sure we'll help more than that. But yeah, that's the pinnacle, I think, of this new career over the last 12 years.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when you've written a book, those who want to follow your footsteps, who wants to be a counselor, I'm sure they will learn from your rich experience about helping people who struggle with addiction. But anyhow, Geoff, it's been an insightful conversation with you. I learned a few bits about, you know, addiction and about, you know, being a counselor. But unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise, and I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
And thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.